sure he gets the money that he's due.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I could, I would encourage the honourable member to write to me on this particular issue, and I'll look into it.
Mr. Cairns.
Mr. Speaker, can I put on record my heartfelt thanks to the Secretary of State and the Minister for Renewables for the action you took last week to put at the heart of local planning decisions food security alongside renewable energy. But can I ask what the government is doing to make sure that all councils immediately enact this, because it is both for local councils and for government, and also whether existing soil assessments will stand for NSIPs or whether they will be redone?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question and for her kind words. I am pleased to confirm to the House that my honourable friend, the member for North East Derbyshire, Minister Ndiluk, has written to all local authorities to draw their attention to the statement last week, which underlined our robust policy on solar farms on our best and most versatile agricultural land. Local planners should know that this government is serious about solar being put in the right places and not on the best and most versatile agricultural land.
Chair of the Committee, Angus Brendan MacNeill.
Mr. Speaker. Zonal pricing has the potential to lower bills for households from Sussex to Shetland, from Stonehaven into the great town of Stornoway. Of course, there are vested interests who will be concerned, such as energy generating companies who are benefiting from the constraint payments raised from customer bills. So what is the government doing to stimulate debate and knowledge about zonal pricing?
I thank the honourable member. It was a pleasure as my return as a Minister to attend his select committee, which he chairs so well. This is part of stage 2 of our wider consultation as part of our REMA review, and we take on board his and his wider committee's constructive suggestions in that meeting.
Simon Fell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A key tool in our arsenal against climate change has got to be sequestering carbon. So it was a pleasure last week to see the Morecambe Bay Net Zero Peak Cluster Vision launched, which could decarbonise 40% of our cement and lime industries, securing a gigaton of carbon under Morecambe Bay. Could I encourage my honourable friend to meet with me to discuss this project further?
I would be delighted to meet with my honourable friend at any time and happy to discuss this and indeed any other matter relating to the subject.
Sir John Hayes, final.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the government has recognised the importance of versatile and productive agricultural land in respect of solar, will they recognise too the threat of a monstrous string of pylons stretching right down the east coast of England? We either care about our green, pleasant land or we don't. For as Keats understood, truth is beauty and beauty truth.
My honourable friend will know that we value taking communities with us and working with them, and I'm having a number of meetings on this very subject to look at new technologies to see what additional options there could be to support local communities as we rapidly upgrade our national grid network.
Okay. That completes questions. We'll let the front bench change over. Before I call the Minister, just to say the Minister will be taking longer than normal for a statement and totally agree with the extra time. So just letting the other front benches know there will be some extra time. We now come to the important statement on infected blood compensation. Minister John Glen.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement following the final report of the infected blood inquiry. Yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke about the anguish that the infected blood scandal brought to those impacted by it. I want to reiterate his words and apologise again today. I am sorry. The Prime Minister also spoke, on behalf of the whole House, of our gratitude to Sir Brian Langstaff and his team for completing his comprehensive report. I think 7 volumes, 2,500 pages. And of our appreciation of all those who came forward as part of the inquiry. It was the greatest privilege of my ministerial career to have met over 40 representatives of the infected blood community in Cardiff, Edinburgh, Belfast, Birmingham and Leeds as we finalised our response to compensation for this appalling tragedy. The whole community's bravery through immense suffering is what has enabled justice today. And I know that many of them will be watching in the gallery. I want to honour their fortitude through their unimaginable pain as I lay out a more detailed response to Sir Brian's second interim report on compensation. We will provide the House with a further opportunity to debate the inquiry's full report after the Whitsun recess. The Government will also respond to each recommendation in full as quickly as possible within its comprehensive response to the report. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister confirmed yesterday that the Government will pay comprehensive compensation to those who have been infected and affected as a result of this scandal. And I will now set out to the House the scheme the Government is proposing. And of course, more details of the scheme will be published online today. We are establishing the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, an arm's-length body to administer the compensation scheme. A shadow body has already been set up and an interim CEO has been appointed. And today, I'm delighted to announce the appointment of Sir Robert Francis as the interim chair of the organisation. The experience and the care that Sir Robert will bring to this role will ensure that the scheme is credible and trusted by the community. His support in delivering this scheme will be invaluable. Mr. Speaker, those who have been infected or affected as a result of this scandal will receive compensation. To be crystal clear, if you have been directly or indirectly infected by NHS blood, blood products, or tissue contaminated with HIV or hepatitis C, or have developed a chronic infection from blood contaminated with hepatitis B, you will be eligible to claim compensation under the scheme. And where an infected person has died, but would have been eligible under these criteria, compensation will be paid to their estate. And this will include where a person was infected with hepatitis B and died during the acute period of infection. But, Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian could not have been clearer. It's not just the harm caused by the infections that requires compensation. It's also the wrong suffered by those affected that must also be compensated for. So when a person with an eligible infection has been accepted onto the scheme, their affected loved ones will be able to apply for compensation in their own right. That means partners, parents, siblings, children and friends and family who have acted as carers of those who are infected are all eligible to claim. Now, I'm aware that being asked to provide evidence of eligibility will likely be distressing, so I'm determined to minimise that as much as possible. And I'm pleased to confirm today that anyone already registered with one of the existing infected blood support schemes will automatically be considered eligible for compensation. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to give thanks to the dedication and hard work of Professor Sir Jonathan Montgomery and the other members of the expert group who were critical in advising on how the government could faithfully translate the recommendations of Sir Brian for the scheme. And in line with our previous commitment, we will publish the names of those experts today. Now, in his report, Sir Brian recommended compensation be awarded with respect to the following 5 categories. An injury impact award, acknowledging the physical and mental injury caused by the infection. A social impact award to address the stigma or social isolation as a result of the infection. An autonomy award, acknowledging how family and private life was disrupted during this time. A care award to compensate for past and future care needs of anyone infected. And finally, a financial loss award for past and future financial losses suffered as a result of the infection. The government accepts this recommendation with two small refinements. Informed by the work of the expert group and designed for simplicity and speed, two other principles that Sir Brian asserted. First, the care award will be directly awarded to the person with the infection or their estate. And second, the financial loss award will be paid either directly to the person with the infection or where an infected person has tragically died before the establishment of the scheme, their estate and affected persons who were dependent on them. Now, sadly, many people have links to multiple individuals who are infected, or are both infected themselves and affected by another's infection. So multiple injury awards will be offered to reflect the scale of the loss and suffering. The scheme will be tariff-based, and we will be publishing an explanatory document including examples of proposed tariffs on gov.uk. However, Mr. Speaker, this is not the end. Over the next few weeks, Sir Robert Francis will seek views from the infected blood community on the proposed scheme before its terms are set in regulations, to make sure that the scheme will best serve those that it's intended for. Now, Sir Robert has welcomed the government's proposals as positive and meaningful, and he will set out more details on engagement with the community shortly. The inquiry recommended that the scheme should be flexible in its awards of compensation, providing both for a lump sum or regular payments. And we agree. And that is why the awards to living infected or affected persons will be offered a lump sum or periodical payments. And where the infected person has died, estate representatives will receive compensation as a single lump sum to then distribute to beneficiaries of the estate as is appropriate. We will also guarantee that any payments made to those eligible will be exempt from income, capital gains and inheritance tax, as well as disregard from means-tested benefit assessments. And we will also ensure that all claimants are able to appeal their award, both through an internal review process in the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and, where needed, the right to appeal to a first-tier tribunal. And our expectation is that final payments will start before the end of the year. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you would permit, I would like to return to the House when the regulations are laid later this year to make a further statement on an update on the delivery of the compensation scheme. But I know from my discussions with the community just how important the existing infected blood support scheme payments are to them. I recognise that many people, sadly, rely on these payments, and they are rightly keen to understand what the government's intentions are. And I want to provide reassurance to all those out there today that no immediate changes will be made to the support schemes. Payments will continue to be made at the same level until the 31st of March 2025, and they will not be deducted from any of these compensation awards. From the 1st of April 2025, any support scheme payments received will be counted towards a beneficiary's final compensation award. This will ensure parity between support scheme beneficiaries, regardless of whether they were the first or the last to have their compensation assessed by the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. And we will ensure that no one receives less in compensation than they would have received in support payments. Now, Mr. Speaker, I recognise that members of the infected blood community are still dying each week from their infections. And there may be people, indeed there will be people listening today, who are thinking to themselves that they may not live to receive compensation. So I want to address those concerns too. Today I'm announcing that the government will be making further interim payments ahead of the establishment of the full scheme. Payments of £210,000 will be made to living infected beneficiaries, those registered with existing infected blood support schemes, as well as those who register with a support scheme before the final scheme becomes operational, and the estates of those who pass away between now and payments being made. I know that time is of the essence, which is why I'm also pleased to say that they will be delivered within 90 days, starting in the summer, so that they can reach those who need it so urgently most. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I would like to turn to the matter of memorialisation. Many of those who were infected by contaminated blood or blood products have since died without knowing that their suffering and loss will be fully recognised, either in their lifetime or at all. The lives of most of those who have died remain unrecognised. And I note Sir Brian's recommendations on memorialisation across the UK. And the government will address those recommendations in detail as part of our wider response to this report. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I know that the whole House will want to join me in thanking Sir Brian and the inquiry for the work that they have done, and pay tribute to all those who have been caught up in this terrible tragedy and battled for justice for so long. Yesterday was a day of great humility for everyone implicated by this inquiry. And today, I can only hope, with the inquiry's report published, and with our firm commitment to compensate those touched by the scandal, the infected blood community knows that their cries for justice have been heard. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just say, lots of members want to get in, and all members will get in. I now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Nick Thomas Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, the infected blood scandal is one of the gravest injustices in our history and a profound moment of shame for the British state. The Leader of the Opposition apologised on behalf of the Labour governments of the past yesterday, and the Prime Minister did the same on behalf of all governments and the country. And I join them today in saying a deep and heartfelt sorry. The scale of the horror that was uncovered by Sir Brian Langstaff's report almost defies belief. And that is why I pay tribute to the victims of this scandal who fought so hard for justice. We thank the charities, the remarkable campaigning work of my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, the Father of the House, the journalist Caroline Wheeler, whose work and book, Death in the Blood, did so much to drive this issue forward. I also recognise the significance of the decision of the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, in establishing the public inquiry, and I thank Sir Brian Langstaff and all his staff for their forensic work. And I also want to say thank you to the Minister for regularly briefing me and for his work in government ahead of today. Mr. Speaker, one of the most powerful conclusions in this report is an apology is only meaningful if it is accompanied by action. And it's that I turn to now. I welcome the further interim payments that the Minister has announced. And I repeat our commitment to work on a cross-party basis to help deliver the compensation scheme and get the money, the final money to victims as soon as possible. And I welcome the further details the Minister has given, including the appointment of the interim chair. And Sir Robert Francis already saying that he is seeking the views of the infected blood community is welcome. Does the Minister agree that continuing to hear that voice of victims going forward is absolutely crucial? I also welcome payments being made under the 5 heads of loss to the infected and the affected. And can the Minister confirm that estimates of the total costs have now been made and there will be no undue delay in those final payments reaching victims? Time is of the essence. One victim continues to die every 4 days. And on that, can the Minister set out some more detail on how the personal representatives of estates will be handled as part of the scheme? Can he also confirm the plans in place to trace people, additional people, who might be eligible for compensation? And could he also say a little more about when we can expect a progress report on Sir Brian Langstaff's other 11 recommendations beyond the establishment of the compensation body? And can I add too my support and the support of all on these benches to the consideration of appropriate and fitting memorials across the different parts of the UK, and indeed, as Sir Brian Langstaff recommends, for the victims who were treated at Trelaws. On potential criminal charges, can the Minister ensure that all relevant evidence is made available for consideration by the prosecuting authorities and any other necessary support provided? Can I also say on Sir Brian Langstaff's findings on institutional defensiveness, of putting the reputation of people and protecting institutions above public service? This follows on from other scandals such as Hillsborough and Horizon. It is why we must deliver a duty of candour and also the political leadership that we need to replace that culture of defensiveness with openness and transparency. Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff's report challenges all of us to make progress on his recommendations. That is what we must now come together to do. The victims deserve nothing less.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his collegiate tone and for the constructive approach he's taken throughout our conversations and in his response this afternoon. Look, I totally embrace the need to continue the dialogue with victims, and that's why I was very pleased that Sir Robert Francis agreed to take on this role, having done the study into the compensation. We have obviously met a number of times where I've explained to him what Jonathan Montgomery and the experts panel did, and I'm pleased that he's got to the point where he's sufficiently satisfied to move forward in this way. As the Prime Minister made clear yesterday, there is no restriction on the budget. Where we need to pay, we will pay. We will minimise delays. We will address the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff with respect to that speed and efficiency and removing as much complexity as possible. He asks about the representatives of different estates and tracing additional claimants. These will be matters that the interim chief executive and the interim chair will look at very carefully. And what I envisage happening is, through the month of June, an exercise to engage meaningfully with representatives of the communities, to look at some of the assumptions in the work of that expert panel that will inform those regulations that we're duty-bound to bring to the House within 3 months of royal assent of the Victims and Prisoners Bill. I think some of the other matters with respect to the appropriate memorialisation and criminal charges and duty of candour, some of which progress is being made in different ways, are probably best left to some of my colleagues at a subsequent point. But as I said, I do anticipate that we'll have an early opportunity to discuss these in full in a debate soon after the Whitsun recess.
We come to Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The House will understand my remarks will be subsidiary to the Right Honourable Lady for Hull North. It's 36 years since I was with the first of my friends who I knew had been infected, and it's 33 years since the person died. Friendships got fractured, families were changed forever. One of the points which I hope my honourable friend will put to his fellow ministers on health is whether those who are still infected in some way can have a kind of National Health Service passport. So when they go to get medical attention, they're not asked the same questions that my constituents were every time. How much you've been drinking, why is your liver in the way it is, and all the rest. It is important, I think, that those who are young in clinicians should actually understand that if you see that there's a haemophilia or a whole blood infection, that you can take for granted a lot of things which you don't need to ask. That humanity, I think, needs to be spread. Can I also say to my honourable friend that I recognise that he is built on the work of our honourable friend, the member for Horsham. And if I can say in a cross-party way that Sue Gray, when she led the civil servants in that, I think deserves respect, as do her successors in the civil service who are putting things right. My last point is this. These are not lottery sums people are being awarded. In some way, they make up for some of the losses and they recognise some of the hurt. In some families, who may not have been used to having much money around, in fact, most of them have been used to having very little money because of the consequences of infections, they may need to have mediation services in case they don't agree. And I think it'd be a good idea if Sir Robert or others could consider whether that could be made available in the same way that other people who suddenly come into some degree of money can get some kind of help, because families sometimes don't find it easy to decide how money should be shared.
I thank my right honourable friend for his comments, and I pay tribute to the work that he's done and the constructive way he's engaged with me over the last 6 months and obviously many years before. He makes the point about his friend and the stigma that has been attached to some of the conditions that some of the victims have had to endure. And obviously that's why in the injury and social impact awards that's reflected in the heads of loss that are reflected in the scheme. He makes some observations about how that better awareness of some of those conditions can be taken forward, and I will discuss that with my ministerial colleagues, and several of them from the Department of Health and Social Care are here today. He mentions my immediate predecessor, but I am very aware that a large number of Paymaster Generals, including one sat next to along from me today, have done an enormous amount of work to get us to this point. And of course, many officials, including James Quinault, who has led the work latterly. So I do want to acknowledge that their contribution, this isn't about me. But I would say to him more broadly that he makes some very wise observations about the need to ensure that the communities that will be given very significant sums of money, rightly so, and in line with what they would be entitled if they went through a legal process, that the appropriate framework of support is in place to assist them through receiving this money in a way that isn't destructive to their lives.
SNP spokesperson Christie.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, Mr Speaker, was a very emotional day for many of us. And I'm privileged that I was with constituents in the Central Hall yesterday, Cathy Young and her two fantastic daughters, Lisa and Nicola, and so I join the Minister in paying great tribute to the infected blood community. When the infected blood community gave a standing ovation to Sir Brian Langstaff yesterday, I think that's a sight that will never, ever leave me, Mr Speaker. So can I echo the public gallery's reaction to the appointment of Sir Robert Francis? For my mind, that's an excellent appointment. And so could the Minister confirm that Sir Robert Francis, for example, will be able to meet the APPG and others in this House? Can he also, and he knows that I have raised this with him, can he guarantee that looking at the composition of the Board of the Compensation Authority going forward, that will include representatives of the infected and affected, and that they will have that what we believe, the rightful representation on that board? Can I welcome the Minister's comments in relation to hepatitis B? This has always been, I think, one of the issues of contention. So can I ask the Minister to consider, some people with hepatitis B have been missing out on the existing schemes, and can he have a look for me to find a way that those with hepatitis B get access to the existing schemes? I know the Scottish Infected Blood Forum has asked him that question. Can he also just clarify in terms of interim payments that he mentioned the living, but so can I ask him if interim payments are going to be made to the estates of those who've sadly passed away? My penultimate question, Minister, is some people will raise eyebrows at the fact that the compensation, or the interim compensation, is less than those in the Post Office. So can he give some explanation as to why the 210,000 figure has been brought about today? I echo the comments made by the Shadow Minister in relation to looking at criminal charges and a Hillsborough law, and I very much welcome his comments on memorial. Does the Minister agree with me that there are two other lessons? The first lesson is that members of this House, regardless of political persuasion, can get together to deliver justice. And the second lesson is that those, like for example in the affected blood community, the key lesson for the general public is never ever give up in fighting injustice.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for, again, his engagement and the points he's made today. I mean, I was there yesterday for the 2 hours of Sir Brian Langstaff's presentation of his report, and it was a very moving moment for all of those who've suffered and waited for so long. I'm grateful for his endorsement of the appointment of Sir Robert Francis. It seemed to be welcomed in the gallery, and I recognise that what is absolutely critical, if this is to be successful, is that the communities need to be fully engaged, and the explanation of how this scheme has been constructed and any concerns around the wider support that's needed are interrogated fully before those regulations come back to the House. But throughout this, it's about reconciling speed and efficiency with consultation. And that's why it was done in the way that I have done it over the last few months. He makes a point about hepatitis B and access to the schemes. I'll be happy to correspond with him separately on that, because obviously there are lots of technical issues there. He asks about the amount of £210,000. You can see it's an irregular amount, because I was trying to get the maximum amount that could be universally paid to those who are infected and alive without any risk of paying the wrong amount. And that was the maximum that I was advised, and as quickly as I could. But what's really important is that we get to the examination of entitlements and get to what that balancing payment is, and get that payment out as quickly as possible. This isn't a stalling tactic, it's trying to reconcile competing priorities of responsible stewardship of taxpayers' money, whilst also trying to do it as quickly as possible for the most vulnerable community. With respect of the memorialisation, I think these are matters where I think there'll need to be wide engagement, and I wouldn't want to make binding commitments today. But I've said what I've said, and I think this will be a matter that myself or other ministers will return to in due course.
Chair of the Health Select Committee, Steve Bryan.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for what he said and how he said it? I know he, the Prime Minister and particularly the Chancellor sat next to him, will make this right. Clearly, the majority of Sir Brian's recommendations are for the health and social care sector, and the Health Select Committee, which I chair, will play its part, working with the Secretary of State and NHS England, I see she's on the bench as well, to ensure that all the recommendations, unlike some previous accepted patient safety recommendations, are implemented. Can I just ask him about the 5 loss categories? They make every sense, and I note his 2 small refinements. But can I just ask him on the financial loss award, if it will reflect the reality for many infected blood victims that they cannot, just as one example, access life insurance? Will it reflect those elements of financial loss, please?
Minister.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for his comments, and I would also like to thank the Chancellor for his unwavering commitment to resolve this in a timely way, both when I was Chief Secretary and now in this role. With respect to the 5 loss categories, he makes a very legitimate point about a specific element of additional burdens, consequential of the conditions that people have. Now, this is a matter that will be no doubt raised by some in the communities, but the structure around injury, social impact, autonomy, care and financial loss, clearly with social impact and autonomy, they capture a range of unspecific, but a basket of goods, if you like, of things that people would have not been able to procure at the same cost. So I can't give him a specific answer on that, but Jonathan Montgomery and his team of experts have tried to do everything they can to look at the law, look what would be entitled in different circumstances, and give the best assessment. And that will be the sorts of conversations that will happen with the communities in the coming weeks.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Minister's statement today? I'm just reflecting on the fact that he's talked about those infected and affected being fully engaged, and I just wanted to gently remind him of the maxim, no decision about us without us, and the lack of transparency so far in the expert panel, and it's only today that we will learn the names of the people who've been advising the government. But can I also welcome the appointment of Sir Robert Francis as the interim chair of the Infected Blood body. Of course, it's worth reflecting on the fact that Sir Brian yesterday put in his report of the failure of government to respond to Sir Robert Francis's compensation framework document, which the leader of the House commissioned when she was a Paymaster General, and the government promised several times that they would respond to. That was never published. So I just wondered if the Paymaster General could just set out, because we've also not had a proper written response to the second interim report from Sir Brian last April, are all the recommendations, all 18, are they being accepted by the government? And if not, why not? And could he also just confirm how the government is going to ensure that the Compensation Authority is accountable directly to Parliament, as recommended by the Infected Blood Inquiry?
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her observations and the engagement that we've had on an ongoing basis since I was appointed. I do take seriously what she says about no decision without full engagement. I made a decision in order to get to this point where we would, in principle, accept the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff, move forward with the independent expert panel. As I've said to her previously, I was always prepared to reveal the names of those individuals. I didn't want them to be distracted while they were doing urgent work to make progress quickly. Their names will be available shortly today. Sir Robert Francis and I had a number of conversations about the interaction between government and the expert group, the logic that I'd used to get to these heads of loss and to get to this scheme today. And I'm delighted that he is in a position where he's prepared to facilitate, in essence, the engagement with the communities. I've also been mindful of the principle of government managing public money, whilst also recognising Sir Brian's imperatives around setting an arm's length body that is arm's length from government in order to restore or generate some trust with a very, very vulnerable community. Reconciling those two has not been straightforward, but she asks about the accountability of the arm's length body. I think these are matters that will need to be discussed further with respect to the regulations that we have to lay before the House. But what I would say to her is that, yes, a number of my predecessors have done a lot of work on this. I am pleased that we've made significant progress, but there is an intense amount of work to be done to deliver this over the next 3 months, and I look forward to working constructively with her, as Sir Robert Francis does, to make sure that we get this to the right place as quickly as possible.
Chair of PACAC, Dame Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've heard descriptions of institutional defensiveness today, but I think we should be very clear about what we're actually talking about. This was a grubby secret, kept secret by the Department of Health. The people who suffered as a consequence of this were treated as an inconvenience to be managed. And this flies in the face of what we are required to do in this House in terms of holding ministers accountable for what happens in their departments. We really do need to learn from this to improve how we behave and how we hold the executive to account in future. If we don't, this incident will shame us all and not just those who are directly responsible. So could I perhaps say to my right honourable friend that what we really need to look at now is make sure that we do properly establish a duty of candour for civil servants in the advice they give to ministers, and a requirement that ministers must satisfy themselves that they are giving appropriate challenge and consideration to the advice they're receiving, so that everyone involved in delivering services in future can be held directly responsible, and this place does not continue to be a charade.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments, and I agree with her instinctive reaction to what Sir Brian says about the duty of candour. It will be for the government more widely to determine how we respond to that in a formal and coherent way. Now, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, when he was in a previous role, moved quite a lot of things forward within the Department of Health, as I know the Honourable Lady knows. But I think it's important when somebody spends that amount of time coming to that depth of evaluation and a number of insights and recommendations, the government looks at it very carefully. But I do think that Sir Brian makes wise observations that we need to heed, listen to, and apply into the way that we do government in this country.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I echo the points that have been made about welcoming the statement today? It's been a long time coming. And for many of my constituents in Edinburgh West, as for many others, and their family and their friends, this is a very poignant day. There have been reassurances called for by organisations like Haemophilia Scotland that the recommendations will be adhered to in a way that perhaps they haven't been in the past. So would the Minister agree that having the involvement with various groups of affected and infected people will help to ensure that that happens?
Absolutely, I agree with the Honourable Lady. And when I went to Edinburgh, I was keen to meet a representative group of Scottish infected blood campaign organisations, and I did so. And I had a very candid conversation with them. I set out where we were as a government, what we were planning to do on this day at a high level. Those conversations need to continue. As I say, the immediate priority is under Sir Robert Francis's guidance. That engagement will continue through the month of June, so that these regulations are informed by the wisdom, experience and views of those we're seeking to support.
Sir David Dent.
Thank you, Speaker. And I start by commending my constituency neighbour, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for her courage, determination and persistence in relentlessly pursuing this matter over the years. I wholeheartedly support her call for the rapid payment of compensation before any more sufferers die, and I know the Minister has that in mind. Now, the Prime Minister said that a travesty like this should never be allowed to happen again. And like the PACAC chairman, I think that rests on this whole question of the duty of candour that Sir Brian Langstoff recommended. And that means a legally enforceable duty of candour for the entire public service, not just some promise. And as it turns out, the Minister has in front of him the opportunity to do that. In front of the Lords, in report stage today, the Victims and Prisoners Bill has a clause imposing a duty of candour, but in a very limited way. Can he look at that clause and expand it to cover the whole of the public sector under all circumstances?
Minister.
Well, I defer to the right honourable gentleman's considerable experience and wisdom on many matters. I do recognise his point, but I do think to move on this matter in this way, in this short time frame, would not be the right step. But I do think that it would be right for us to urgently engage with him and the committee and others to ensure that the government comes up with the right complete response to deal with a very sensible point that Sir Brian has made.
Amber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to pay tribute to my constituents whose lives have changed forever and the many campaigners who have fought for so many years for truth and justice affected by this scandal. From Hillsborough to the Post Office to the infected blood scandal and many, many more. We have watched states and institutions cover up wrongdoing and blame the innocent with no accountability. Minister, how long do we have to wait for those in this place to finally act and rebalance the scales of justice and to deliver a full Hillsborough law? Yesterday's events show how necessary that law is to begin to end the culture of cover-ups that is shamefully hardwired into our institutions.
Well, I very much respect the points he's made about the Hillsborough. I mean, I'm not able to answer his question specifically on that today. My remarks are around the compensation scheme, but I think there are a number of points made about the incidence of public inquiries on a range of issues, what that says about our state and the failure of it in different ways. And as the Honourable Gentleman says, the considerable effort required that should never have been required by individuals to apprehend the state for what has happened. These are wider matters that we will need to come to terms with, but I don't think I'll be able to do justice to his remarks today.
Caroline Knowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that today's statement is about compensation, but there was no opportunity yesterday nor much today to ask specifically about Lord Mayor Treloar College in Hampshire. My constituent, Mike Webster, sent his son Gary, a constituent of my honourable friend, the member for Eastleigh, to Treloar's back in the late 70s and early 80s. And he wrote to me last month saying how distraught he was that that school is now trying to paint itself as a victim when in fact we know it was in receipt of funds to conduct experiments on children. Can my right honourable friend give me some assurance from the dispatch box that the government is considering very carefully how the Helsinki Declaration may have been breached and some guidance as to what future steps may be taken?
Good one more. Minister.
The right honourable lady very eloquently makes a very, very important point. And I met with, in the course of my engagement, a number of former pupils from Treloar's school. And I believe that Sir Robert, in his report, one full volume pertains to what happened there, where so many individuals underwent medical treatment that was not envisaged by their parents and where consent appears not to have been secured. This is a massive aspect of the work of Sir Brian Langstaff, and the government will need to examine it very carefully and the implications for who is culpable and how we should most appropriately respond to avoid anything like that happening again. And I hope what I've said today with respect to compensation will give some modest measure of comfort to those that I met and those like them who aren't here today.
Jessica Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There aren't words enough to pay tribute to all those campaigners infected and affected, and they include my constituent Lynn, who lost Bill, the Smiths, and I also pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, and journalists like Caroline Wheeler. The Smiths lost Colin, aged just 7 years old, to AIDS, having been given infected blood from Arkansas prison at 10 months old. And we now know from the inquiry that risks of giving this blood were known. Lynn and the Smiths want sorry to turn into something today for those who die every week. So on their behalf, can I say to the Minister today make sure we have a proper timeline for this and that we stick to it, implement the recommendations as fast as possible, put the victims at the heart of the decision making, and no more delays. This group of people have waited far too long and have been through far too much already. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Smiths also want their son to have his name back, although they have always made sure that we have never forgotten it. So can I say it today? Colin John Smith.
Minister.
Thank you. The Honourable Lady makes a moving tribute to her constituents, and I can assure her that the Government has heard the pleas that have been made, and we have set out today a clear timetable on the journey to the regulations. I will update the House later in the early autumn with the Speaker's permission on where we've got to on then the timeline for further detail, subject to the advice of the interim CEO and the interim chair. She makes the point about stigma as well, which is obviously a massive, massive part of this for so many that I met and for her constituents and the Smith family. We recognise that as part of the scheme, but I think the memorialisation process must also recognise particularly those who were so badly stigmatised in the 80s and 90s.
Paul Bristow.
Speaker, I know from meeting some of the affected community in Peterborough, the Minister talked about stigma. I heard about the discrimination that they faced and also a lack of trust in public institutions many of the community faces. This all leaves a very long legacy. With this in mind, how confident is he that this scheme will benefit or will affect everyone infected, and anyone who's been infected will capture everybody despite this long legacy? And how confident is he that everyone who should be compensated will come forward?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I am confident that this scheme will work. It will work as quickly as it possibly can. I mentioned the interim payments of $210,000 today to the infected who are alive. But the speed with which we process applications of affected and infected is very much what is on my mind as we've set up this shadow ALB. And I will be continuing to work with my officials to do everything we can to move the timeline from the right to the left, conscious of how long people have waited for so long.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I welcome the fact that the Minister has moved so quickly. The sorrow expressed yesterday had to be translated into action, and the fact that the authority has been set up, the chairman who will have the confidence of the victims has been established, and payments will be made quickly, at least interim payments made quickly, is good. But for people like my constituent Trevor Marston, who was used as an experiment by people who described children as cheaper than chimps and more readily available, justice will only be given when those who cynically used their position, that they devised experiments, denied that they were happening, then tried to destroy the evidence, then defend their actions. Those people only have justice when the elite within the civil service and the professionals who cynically abuse their position know that they will face criminal charges, because that's what they are, and face criminal charges, and that this government will make sure that all of the evidence is made available so that they can be brought to justice.
Minister.
The right honourable gentleman makes a very powerful representation on behalf of Trevor Marsham and more generally with respect to some of the conclusions that Sir Brian has made in his remarks. What happened was truly shameful with respect to experimentation. As he will be aware, today I am speaking to the issue of compensation, but it is an urgent matter to really isolate who knew what when, take that from the report and establish what courses of action in different ways across the range of issues we've had raised here in the House today. What is the most appropriate way to deal with all of them?
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what my right honourable friend has set out?
and welcome in particular the efforts that he and his predecessors have clearly made to remove friction from the process of getting the victims of this unforgivable episode the compensation they clearly deserve. But he will recognise that as the system beds down and begins to operate, there is always the risk of that friction creeping back in. And can he make sure that he and his ministerial colleagues keep their eyes on this process, work with Sir Robert Francis to make sure that this process continues to be without friction, so that people continue to be able to easily access the compensation they need?
Minister. Absolutely. My right honourable friend makes a very wise point. The need to swiftly expedite payments in full to as many qualifying people as possible is the imperative that has guided me to this point. And it will be the imperative that Sir Robert will take forward in his conversations. We must not introduce unnecessary complexity to establish people's qualification to receive a payment when that is unnecessary. So there is a tension, but we've got to actually resolve it to get these payments out, and that's why we will need to, and the arm's length body will need to prioritise too, particularly around those groups that are infected alive and those that are suffering most, many of whom I met recently.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister understand that as well as a duty of candour, we really need, as my right honourable friend, the member for Garston and Hale Wood, has consistently put before this House, a public advocate to make certain that victims in future of scandals such as this have somebody to look after them and take them through processes, and that would stop this happening ever again. Can he say something about when he expects all of the payments to have been made? He's talked about an interim scheme which goes on to the end of this financial year, and then he's talking about the full payments being made going further forward. When is his deadline for getting this done?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for a question. She talks about the public advocate. I am not in a position to respond to that today, but it's clearly one option that is available, and I think will be part of the wider response to the report. To be clear, the interim payments of £210,000 to the infected alive that I've announced today will be paid within 90 days starting in the summer. But the full payments will begin by the end of the year. But I'm constrained somewhat because we're setting up an arm's length body. Now, there is an interim chief executive, and I think there'll be 20 people employed in this organisation by the end of next week. But I can't account for the processes and the way it will be established, and therefore how quickly. But everything I've said to David Foley, who is the interim chief executive, is designed to impress on him the need for speed to expedite as many of these claims as quickly as possible in full.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Minister on his statement? I know from our conversations how seriously he takes his moral duty on this issue. But I also know from the work done at the Cabinet Office in the summer of 2022 in getting the first interim payments out that one of the most fraught areas of consideration will be wider eligibility. And that's not just a function of complexity, it's also a function of capacity. Now, the Minister mentioned that the arm's length body will have 20 employees in the next couple of weeks. But could he just reassure the House that if Sir Robert Francis comes back in a few months' time and said, in order to make quick decisions, I need more capacity and therefore more people, there will be no quibbling on adequate resource in this organisation to fulfil the Minister's rightly identified priority of getting this money out as quickly as possible to as many people as possible?
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his observations, and I thank him for what he did when he was in office to bring forward interim payments and to make progress. I mean, he's right with respect to the business case for the arm's length body and the plans for the number of people needed to be employed in it. I expect Sir Robert and the interim chief executive to be iteratively working up plans to expedite this as quickly as possible and to assert what they need in terms of resourcing to make it deliver as quickly as possible. And I'll do everything I can to prioritise swift delivery in the decisions that I make.
to Philippa Whitford.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The timeline that is in Sir Brian's report highlights the litany of failures, delays and cover-ups over decades that actually resulted in even more patients being exposed to hepatitis C and HIV. While several countries accepted liability and set up compensation schemes in the mid-90s, UK victims have had to spend another 30 years of their lives not just dealing with ill health, but fighting for justice. Now, I welcome the vast majority of what the Minister has announced this morning, and I'm sure everyone across the House does. But the members of the infected blood community who are here this morning will be really concerned to hear his comments that imply a threat to the ongoing support payments. So does he accept it's not just a matter of saying the infected blood community will be involved in the compensation scheme, but will their wishes be listened to?
Hear,
hear.
Absolutely they will. And when I was in Edinburgh, I was very keen to ensure, and I had long conversations about the need to understand the integration of the existing infected blood scheme, support schemes, which present in a different way and offer meaningful psychological and other support services to those communities in different parts of the United Kingdom. As two parts of the heads of loss, we're talking about past and future care costs and loss of income, past and future. And so we're consolidating those into a lump sum, but I have made the absolute commitment that nobody will be worse off. There are a couple of categories where there is potential risk of that, and we will make sure that nobody will be worse off. But the sensitivity in the delivery of this scheme, in terms that the various communities across the United Kingdom will be comfortable with, is at the top of my mind and is going to be instrumental in determining the regulations that are formed that guides this into law in the next few months.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend for his statement and indeed for the tone the government has taken with regard to this most grave scandal. It's striking, isn't it, that the chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, has said that his job isn't yet done and that he will only regard his terms of reference as fulfilled when the government responds within a period of 12 months on his recommendations. And importantly, he will only regard his job done if he feels that there's nothing more that he can do in order to prevent delay. Bearing in mind the government has to respond to the second interim report and indeed now this final report, can my right honourable friend assure me and this House and indeed the wider public that he and the government will do everything they can to ensure that Sir Brian's role is fulfilled as swiftly as possible?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Absolutely, I can reassure him of that. Today's announcements on compensation and the documents that will flow through will be a substantive response to meet the expectations of many in the communities, and the formalisation of those responses will be something I will consider very carefully to bring clarity to the matter.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you. Could I put on record the thanks, I think, of all of us to the campaigners, but also to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull. As someone who campaigned for many years on postmasters, I know how lonely it is at times when you're taking on the state and no one believes you. Can I welcome what the Paymaster General has announced today in terms of compensation scheme based on tariffs? But can I tell him from my experience as a member of the Post Office Horizon Advisory Board that the big work now starts in terms of agreeing those levels of those tariffs. And can I ask him whether or not the government will pay individual claimants' legal bills, because they will need some legal advice on that. And can I also just echo what the Father of the House said earlier on? A lot of money is going to be paid out here to people. You will get unscrupulous individuals trying to prey on people. Can I suggest that we ensure that they get financial advice and support when those payments are made?
Minister.
Well, not for the first time. The honourable gentleman makes some very wise points, and I'm grateful to him for doing so. And I accept a number of the points he's made with respect to the concern around tariffs. These tariffs have not been set up with financial constraints. they've been set up with the input of a range of experts to make a judgment on what would be appropriate versus what would be legally entitled to. What now needs to happen is that the assumptions behind those bandings, those severity bandings, etc., need to be explained and scrutinised, and that's what is going to happen. He makes a very reasonable point about the concern around unscrupulous people claiming, and again, and also, so the issue there really is, how do you put safeguards in place while expediting for all of those quickly who are qualified? He makes a very reasonable point about the professional support of lawyers and financial advisors, which is also something at the top of my mind, learning from some of the other scandals that I was familiar with in my previous role as Economic Secretary, and I will take those to heart in the future.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by paying tribute to my constituent, Paul Bloor, for his campaigning. Paul started at Truro College in 1974 and was infected with hepatitis C from contaminated blood products. I regret that I personally hadn't grasped the full horrendousness of what has gone on, and I thank Sir Brian for ensuring that we all now do understand. Paul welcomes compensation, but what he asked me to raise with the Minister was about accountability and what work is now being done to ensure that we can now pursue any avenues of personal accountability for those that deserve to have their conduct looked at.
Minister.
Well, I can totally understand why Paul would want that point raised. I mean, these matters go beyond my brief on compensation. I think the whole House will recognise this is an urgent matter that other ministers and other departments will need to address properly and in full. I hope that the debate after Whitsun will give us an opportunity to really open up into all of those matters as a House, and therefore for the government to respond appropriately as quickly as possible. Some of the things that happened were completely against the values of the institutions that those individuals were part of. We need to really fully examine it and come to terms with it and make sure it can never happen again.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can we accept that institutional defensiveness has not gone away and will only go away when we in this House act to make it go away? For the past few years, I've been working with constituents who were the victims of a Ponzi scheme. They lost millions of pounds. They were failed repeatedly by first the FSA and the FCA. They have been left out of pocket to the tune of almost £2 million in legal fees, in which the FCA has no apparent interest. Would he meet with me and other honourable members who have affected constituents and some of the victims themselves to see what can be done to deliver for them the good intentions that he has expressed today?
Minister.
Well, thank you. I'm very sorry to hear about his constituents, and if there's a matter related to the FCA, I know from my prior experience that the member for Hitchin and Harpington is best placed, the current Economic Secretary, to address that. I do understand the problem with the jurisdiction of the FCA, particularly with unregulated activities, but I really don't think I'd be able to help him. I think he should address that question very respectfully to my colleague in the Treasury.
Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that my right honourable friend the Minister has done a diligent job here, reflective of his attitude to the overall need and the gravest of situations here. However, it all ought to have been done earlier, and I hold in mind my former constituent Annie Walker, who died in 2016, and I wish she had been able to see this before she did. She told me she was tired of having to keep campaigning. I also have in mind a current constituent who I will not name, but who I work with regularly on this, and he has asked me particularly to make the point here today about the care schemes, the support schemes that are, as per the Minister's statement, due to change. He and I would be very grateful for as much clarity as possible on that. I think that will be needed by many involved. And may I finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, urge the Minister and his colleagues in government to bring forward those regulations as soon as possible. If I understand it correctly, Sir Robert Francis may be taking a number of weeks. He's mentioned the month of June, and we heard the figure of 5 weeks. So can I take it that we may see those regulations in July, which would allow, I hope, all members of this House, not just a select committee of this House, selected committee of this House, to do its job on scrutinising those regulations and get the job done as fast as possible.
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions and for her engagement with me personally over recent weeks, and I recognise the fact that she refers to an unnamed constituent is also, provokes me to acknowledge the fact that so many people have been so traumatised by their experiences and the stigma associated with their conditions that they haven't been able to be as open as possible as they would like. Now, with respect to the time frame, the government submitted to a 3-month obligation to bring those regulations forward from royal assent of the bill, which will happen, I think, in June or July. Of course, therefore, if you come back from that, there'll be time where we have to lay them before the House. I want to make sure that we do that in the most timely way possible. The purposeful intent with the engagement under Sir Robert's leadership is to make sure that that is meaningful, but also addresses that imperative around time.
Ben Bradshaw.
The very welcome appointment of Sir Robert Francis, who did such an excellent job chairing the inquiry into the scandal in mid-Staffordshire, is a reminder that we're very good at inquiries in this country, but we're terrible at implementing their recommendations. And I'd like to make a suggestion to the Minister, and this is as applicable to my own front bench, is something that might reduce the chances of this kind of thing happening again, is to ask every permanent secretary in Whitehall how many recommendations are still on the books from previous inquiries that have not been implemented. Let's have the list, and let's have a good reason, a very good reason, why they haven't been implemented.
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question, and I would echo his tribute to Sir Robert Francis. And one of the reasons I was keen to secure his ongoing work is because of the excellent work he did with the study into compensation, which has obviously been important to move us forward to this point. I think the challenge to permanent secretaries about recommendations not dealt with is a very reasonable one. I'm not quite sure how best I can take that forward, but I will seek advice and at the next opportunity let him know how we're getting on with it.
Celine Saxby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I spoke with my emotional constituent, Paul Jules from Braunton, yesterday, who wanted to express his gratitude to Sir Brian that the truth had come out. He contracted hepatitis C following a blood transfusion during chemotherapy in 1983. And now trains therapy dogs to give hope and support to others. Can my right honourable friend give him hope that compensation will be rapid and simple to enable him and others impacted to finally reach closure?
Minister.
Yes, I certainly can. That has been driving the government over recent months, and I very much hope that in the progress that we will make, I'm sure that we will give more detail on exactly how and when the profile of work of the arm's length body will play out in the coming months and the remainder of this year and beyond.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The thing is, this will all happen again unless we change the way we do our parliamentary politics, because Parliament failed, as well as the whole of British politics. Yeah. There are some notable exceptions, of course. My honourable friend, who I think of not only as a right honourable friend for Hull, but as, frankly, a companion of honour with a capital C and a capital H. But the truth is, Parliament was misled repeatedly over decades. In all those decades, there wasn't a single report from a select committee into infected blood. We didn't do our job properly. So isn't it really time that we do have change in the way we do our parliamentary and our government politics in this country? Perhaps a bit more power in Parliament rather than always in government? Wouldn't it be a good idea if it was always the people first, not the government first? And the people first, not the institution or the department first, and the people first, not the party first? And doesn't that really require a legally enforceable duty of candour placed not just on ministers through the ministerial code, which I think should be in statute, but also on all our civil servants?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his thoughtful assessment, and it chimes with what I thought yesterday when I heard Sir Brian live speak to the 1,200 people in Central Hall. What was striking was the range of institutional failure. Yes, government, yes, politicians, of course, but also civil servants, doctors, and everyone or many people in positions of authority. He makes a clear suggestion of a rebalancing across different institutions, and I recognise the specificity of Sir Brian's challenge and recommendations. As I've said earlier, the government will need to respond powerfully to that, and we will do so in due course.
Mary Robbins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome today's statement and to my right honourable friend in setting out the 5 heads of harm, and also welcome Sir Robert Francis as the interim head of the new authority. Of course, it's taken a long time to get here, and one of the biggest harms has been in the delay to see this day, and a lot of people will be feeling that really, really acutely. We need to avoid this again, and part of that is addressing the cover-up culture which we have in so many of our organisations. Would my right honourable friend support me in saying that we need to have a change in our legislation to ensure that right across the public sector and in our society we have a desire for openness, for transparency, and we get rid of this cover-up culture once and for all.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady puts it very well. I agree with her assessment. We need to come to terms with the fact that there are flaws in the way that we operate at the moment. They've been powerfully and vividly depicted in the report of Sir Brian Langstaff, and the government must respond in a suitably comprehensive way.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to recognise the valuable, incredible work of many of the campaign groups, not least the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, chaired by my constituent Joyce Donnelly, whose husband Tom was infected and passed away as a result of hepatitis C. Joyce was in the gallery yesterday and earlier today, and she and others have acted as conveners and advocates for the wider community at great personal cost, not just financial, but also the time and effort put in to those roles. So will that effort and cost be taken into account in the calculation of compensation, or are there other means of support that the government can provide ongoing to the campaign and advocacy groups? Because Joyce described her forum as stony broke.
Minister. Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes a powerful representation on behalf of Joyce Donnelly, who I believe I've met. And look, the purpose of today's announcement is to bring an end as quickly as possible to the need for campaigning, is to provide comprehensive compensation to all those who qualify as quickly as possible. However, as the Right Honourable Lady member for Kingston upon Hull North said, we do need to ensure that the different communities are comfortable with what is being proposed and in the detail are familiar with how these calculations of the tariffs have been made and how to give and how they will work out. So rather than me as a government minister prescribing what should happen, I'm trying to facilitate that process by giving the opportunity for someone they clearly respect to lead that process of engagement urgently to inform the regulations that underpin this new body.
Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the statement by the Minister to ensure that compensation is paid quickly. And I pay a real tribute to all the campaigners who have fought day and night to get to where we are today. And of course, the Right Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull. And it was a pleasure to support her amendment on this very important matter to move this situation to where it is today. Can I, Madam Deputy Speaker, refer to the email from my constituent Colin Midgley in 2015, where he said to me, how many more of us will have to go to the grave before a full final settlement is achieved? Sadly, his father passed away in 2018. And he then says, my dad had to jump through hoops with people coming to assess him regularly to get some help. That cannot be right. And with that being the case, can I say this to the Minister by other question? He said with regards to the assessment will be done as quickly and as widely as possible. Can I ask him that test for qualification, please, can that be as wider as it possibly can, and it can be done as quickly as it possibly can to ensure that people get the justice that they need?
Minister.
Yes, I'm very happy to give my honourable friend the assurance that he asked for. it was very clear in all the conversations I've had, and I know colleagues across the House have had so many conversations too that have informed the representations made in this place, that speed is of the essence. There are a number of ad hoc schemes that have existed over the years, and various governments, to be fair, of all parties have amended and sought to upgrade them. But this compensation scheme is qualitatively very different. It is an admission of culpability, of responsibility of the state, and it is to mark that responsibility, and it is different qualitatively, but we do need to get the alignment of the different schemes to that journey of assessment done as quickly as possible, and that is what we will do.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I represent 5 individuals or families infected or affected by the NHS infected blood scandal. One constituent was infected with hepatitis C as a child through contaminated blood products used at Manchester Royal Children's Hospital, but he was forced to use all his stage 2 payments of £50,000 to pay for the treatment Harvoni when he developed cirrhosis of the liver. He should not have had to do that, and I hope there will be redress for that. Another constituent, single mother, died aged 47 after being infected with HIV after a routine blood transfusion. Before she died, she had to keep her condition secret due to stigma and ignorance that existed at that time. As she was a single mother, her family have never had any compensation. On their behalf, can I ask the Paymaster General first to clarify what sum has been allocated for compensation? What is the size of the package? And will it be open-ended? Because people, as we know, are still developing conditions. He confirms, I believe, that new interim compensation payments will be made within 90 days, but he seems unable to say what the timeline for full compensation payments will be. And finally, I do want to underline the point made by my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Hull North, about the need to ensure that the Compensation Authority is accountable to Parliament. We must have that. And can I finally, most finally, commend my right honourable friend for all her work on this campaign.
Yeah. Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her points, and let me address them. I think the first point that she makes is that everyone who's been impacted by this scandal is an individual and has had a different pathway in terms of vulnerability, financial obligations, difficulty accessing the schemes. And that's why it's important that I reinforce the fact that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will have an appeal mechanism and will have the right to go to a tribunal if people believe that the tariff-based system does not reflect the circumstances that individuals may have experienced. And there is no restraint in terms of being able to use the legal system as well, if that is what people wish to do. I did say that the interim payments will be paid within 90 days starting this summer, the interim payments, the 210,000 payments. I also said that the full payments will start by the end of this year, and I can confirm that's the calendar year to remove any ambiguity. I forget the size of the... Sorry, thank you. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister have been very clear. We will pay whatever it costs. I can't tell her what that number is because we haven't yet finalised the severity bandings and verified the work of the tariffs. That's the meaningful engagement that we are having with the communities, supervised by Sir Robert Francis. There are obviously wide ranges of numbers of particularly affected, those qualified by virtue of the qualification of the infected person. And so, those numbers don't exist. The principle, though, is that this scheme is accessible to those that I've set out. It should be accessible to, and the government will pay whatever it costs to meet those obligations.
Robin Walker.
I welcome what my honourable friend just said about paying whatever it costs. It is absolutely essential that we are prepared to do that. The government accepted moral culpability some time ago and has now accepted financial liability for this. Can he assure, on behalf of all those constituents for whom justice delayed has been justice denied, that he will move as swiftly as possible to deliver for them, but we'll bear in mind the lessons of the Northern Irish Victims Compensation Scheme, which we were able to get through this House in a single day when there was the political will to do so, and that he will continue to engage and listen and support Robert Francis in his engagement with the infected and affected to make sure that this scheme delivers for everybody.
Minister.
My honourable friend makes very wise and sensible points built on a lot of experience of government, and as a constituency MP, I can endorse all that he's asked. There will be a Dear Colleague letter going out to all MPs and a Dear Stakeholder letter, as well as a number of other documents giving details of the schemes that I've mentioned today. And there will be an attempt to move this forward as quickly as we can, using, I think, a cross-party consensus on what we're trying to achieve.
Liz Savile Roberts.
Christopher Thomas of Pensheen was one of the first patients with haemophilia to be treated by Professor Arthur Bloom of Cardiff. Christopher died in 1990, aged 46. His wife Judith describes how they felt the haematologist to be a friend of the family because they were obviously often visiting him in hospital for treatment. Yet Professor Bloom's name is mentioned repeatedly in Sir Brian Langstaff's report as somebody, and I quote, who disastrously over-influenced the Department of Health and Social Security in the 70s and 80s. Now, the Minister has mentioned a range of institutional failure. Surely he must agree that today we should indeed hear more details of how legislation in relation to duty of candour will be brought forward. If he can't, and I appreciate it's not his department, if he can't give us details today, could he let us know when?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady makes a very sensible point. I'm too struck by the reference to Professor Bloom and his role in different ways over the years. And look, with 2,500 pages and 7 volumes, to do justice to that and come up with a serious response, it will take a bit of time. But I do recognise the determination that the government has collectively to address this as quickly as possible in the right way, listening to the will of this House. First opportunity to do that will be a debate sometime after Whitsun that I intend to open with somebody from the Department of Health winding up, in order that we can actually begin to give an outline of when these things need to be properly addressed in policy terms.
Siobhan Bailey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Minister for the thoughtful and thorough statement that is so clearly informed by his extensive discussions with the community. And he knows I've spoken to him many times about my constituent Sally Ann and her family and how this devastating scandal has affected them. Now, I really hope that much of what the Minister has said today about compensation will provide Sally Ann and others with comfort, but we all know that with the best will in the world and the most planning up here, that there will be difficulties in implementation of such a massive and complex compensation scheme. And I was thinking, when the Minister said that the compensation will not impact means-tested benefits, for example, I have a sense of relief, but we also know where government departments and computer systems have to speak to each other, there will be difficulties. So can I just push the Minister to understand that the community's voices will continue to be heard by the arm's length body, and that we are going to be able to adapt and change the scheme where necessary to make sure that it actually works for those on the ground, because I know he's worked so hard for that to happen.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks and a constructive point around the arm's length body, how it needs to evolve and fit the expectations of the communities. I absolutely am committed to that. She mentions her constituent Sally Ann. Every individual is a priority to me as the Minister, and to deliver this as efficiently as we possibly can. She talks about benefits disregards. I mentioned the tax disregards as well. The systems need to recognise what we're doing with these payments to individuals. We've tried to address everything we can think of to make this flow as quickly as possible, and I hope indeed that will be the case. And she very much have to speak to me again if there are others she wants to raise.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are indebted to Sir Brian Langstaff for the comprehensive work that he has undertaken.
However, it does leave many questions about the transparency and accountability of government, to this place, to committees, but also to the public. Can we ensure, moving forward, that those infected and affected are involved in co-producing the outcomes of the recommendations, but also that the separate departments are held to account, not least the Department of Health, saying many of those recommendations will fall on that department, and that the Secretary of State for that department is directly accountable in this new spirit of transparency to this House and beyond.
Minister.
So I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. And of course, many of these events happened over a very wide time span, back 40 or 50 years. But the issue is, what can we do going forward? She makes a very reasonable point about involving the infected and affected communities in this process. And clearly, one of the things that I've mentioned is the arm's length body having sufficient distance from government to give confidence to the community. We need to get that right, and we need to make sure that the appropriate governance is in place so that the representatives of those communities can have meaningful influence in how they engage going forward and on the wider issues that she's mentioned.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I really welcome this detailed and thorough statement, and I welcome it on behalf of two of the victims in particular. An unnamed constituent who actually came to my first ever advice surgery back in 2010 at Huddersfield Town Hall. He told me how during a blood transfusion he'd been infected with HIV, hepatitis C and CJD. But also on behalf of another victim, Mel McKay, who, although she's not a constituent, she lives on the east coast of Yorkshire, we've become friends over many years whilst campaigning on this issue. But can I also ask that, as well as delivering compensation rapidly, can the Minister also confirm there will actually be no time limits at all on when the victims actually start applying and completing their applications for compensation?
Minister.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. We will be having a review after 3 years to look at what the lifespan of the arm's length body should be. I acknowledge the challenge too with people who've got multiple conditions, and that's why I think I mentioned in my statement multiple awards, and that was one of the issues that the independent expert panel grappled with. But we want to make this accessible to everyone who is entitled, and I don't want to have artificial cut-off points that aren't that are unnecessary. But we do also need to make sure that we have an organisation that's fit for purpose to deliver this quickly.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents Della Rines and Ruth Spellman have been active coming to Parliament and talking about the distress experienced by their families for many, many years. And my question is, firstly, would the Minister and the Shadow Ministers pay tribute to their work? But secondly, whether the Minister envisages that there will be any criminal convictions or any manslaughter charges due to individuals who may have really done the wrong thing.
Well, I'm very happy to pay tribute to the work of Della and Ruth. Sometimes many of these individuals have been campaigning for 20, 30 or 40 years, and I pay tribute to all of them today. With respect to the criminal charges, I'm just not in a position today to make a comment on that, but I do think that there will be work to be done to examine the report fully and make an assessment of those at a future point.
Caroline Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Paymaster General's statement today, and I'd like to put my thanks also on the record to Sir Brian and pay tribute to the campaigners who never gave up, and one campaigner in particular in my own constituency, who I won't name, but will know that I'm speaking of her. She lost her mother and can never be compensated for that, but she also gave up her job and her income. She doesn't regret it for a moment, but it has left her financially fragile in these later years, to the point that I've advocated with her mortgage lender for a stay of execution, a breathing space ahead of any potential compensation. So I know my right honourable friend can't comment on individual cases, but can he restate that as a child of a victim, she has been affected. I believe she qualifies on multiple measures. But can he today restate that for the lender and for her confidence and for my satisfaction? And really, again, I add my voice to that dire need for swift action. Time is precious.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her sensitive portrayal of the individual circumstances of her constituent. And of course, this financial vulnerability that impacts so many affected because of the impact on the infected is why that we are bringing forward the scheme in the way that we have. I think she also highlights, well, I'm happy to confirm that the affected individual will be able to claim in their own right, informed by the qualification of the infected individual and the estate of the infected individual. But again, I recognise that a tariff-based system will inevitably have limitations. And so therefore, that's why the appeal mechanism, not beyond getting the parameters absolutely right in terms of severity bandings, care costs and so on, there must also be an appeal mechanism, a mechanism to challenge, such that we can ensure that everyone receives justice in an individual way.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Minister, earlier this year, on the 18th of January, I raised the case of my constituent, Nigel Wimborne, a victim of infected blood. As a result, Nigel developed various health issues, including renal failure and liver cirrhosis. Nigel wanted, and I quote, a faster resolution to the infected blood scandal compensation before it's too late for myself and others to see full and final resolution. Sadly, Nigel was too ill and he contacted me again and his sister mentioned that she did not want him to be the latest statistic in this horrible affair. Nigel passed away on the 9th of March. He was just 63 years old. I spoke to his partner earlier this morning, and he's absolutely devastated. They've lived together for over 20 years, and he dedicated his life, giving up his career to be Nigel's full-time carer. So on his behalf, I asked the Minister, that 90 days will seem like 90 years for them. Can this timeline be expedited as soon as possible?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her tribute to Nigel and his life, and I'm very sorry for obviously the loss to his family. I do recognise the frustration of even one day's delay. I have done everything I can to move these payments forward as quickly as I possibly can, recognising all the different dependencies. If I could write the cheques myself personally, I would, but I can't. And I will continue to do all that I can. I said that these payments would begin in the summer. I want them to happen as soon as possible. 90 days isn't a deadline. I mean, it's not an obligation, and we wanted to get them out as soon as possible, and where we can, we will.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the statement today, just as I welcomed the Prime Minister's statement yesterday. My constituent Alan has been campaigning for 37 years for justice. He himself was infected as part of this scandal. The more I find out about this, the more chilling it becomes. Frankly, sometimes it reads like a plot from a horror movie. And maybe one day it might even be one. But that is how bad and chilling this scandal is. But of course we know that this isn't the only example of public organisations failing the people who it's there to serve. Will the Minister confirm to me that transparency and accountability when it comes to our public service will be the key tenet and will rule the day?
Minister.
Absolutely I can. The Honourable Gentleman makes a very wise point. We do need to, not only in the conduct of this exercise, but more generally, be as transparent as possible. What Sir Brian spoke about yesterday was a sort of insidious conflation of failure across multiple institutions that over time resulted in catastrophic outcomes. We need to come to terms properly with that and ensure that we put in whatever it takes to stop those things from happening again.
Paul Gervin.
Minister, thank you for your statement today to the House. I find it
ironic that we have to wait to a public inquiry to actually try and get things moving, and it's difficult to see why it took so long, and find that we have a culture within our, not just government, but within departments, and especially the Department of Health, where whistleblowers are targeted and clarity is not brought out. But in saying that, I want to just ask a question in relation to the 12 recommendations brought forward by Sir Brian. The timeline for implementation of all of those recommendations, which go across departments, and this would mean taking this to Cabinet and ensuring that all departments address the aspects of this report that affect them. And I want to see a timeline for that and know what dates we can ensure that all implementation of all 12 recommendations.
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He's right to set the need for a timeline on this. I'm not in a position to do that today, but I have set out that the House will have the opportunity for a debate on the report soon after Whitsun. I think that will be the opportunity to give some initial clarity on what steps are going to be taken. As you can appreciate, and I think the whole House will appreciate, as the honourable gentleman appreciates, and the whole House appreciates, there's a lot of complexity in this, and we want to give timetables that we can honour and deliver on.
Holly Mumby-Croft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I draw my right honourable friend's attention again to the issue of tracing all of those affected and supporting those who may not be known to the inquiry, may not be registered with one of our really good support organisations, and who may not be on any list. I've just today had contact from a family in my constituency, one of whom is very unwell with an illness they believe they contracted from transfusions they had in the 1970s and 80s. What advice would he give them on the steps that they should take to determine if they are eligible for this compensation?
Minister.
Well, the honourable lady, as ever, makes a very sensible point. The issues around, as time evolves backwards, or as time backwards, the issues of verifying what it takes to qualify if somebody isn't registered at the moment is something very much that the new body will need to clarify. I hope that through this process of meaningful engagement in the coming weeks, that some of these issues can be satisfactorily resolved. We want to be as accessible as we can to all those that qualify and make the verification process for those that qualify as straightforward as reasonably possible, and that is the guiding principle. The details of that I can't give here today, but she makes a point that I will come back to at a future point.
Lloyd Russell-Moore.
Thank you. I pay tribute to my constituent Mark Ward, who is here today and who contacted me very early on when I became Member of Parliament, and who has continued, as with many, to be dogged in their campaign. And this is some vindication, but justice will not be served until they have seen all the aspects of the report being implemented. I want to ask a few specific questions. The Minister says that he couldn't set the interim payments above £210,000 because of fear of the safety of those payments. Is he implying that £210,000 is therefore a potential minimum payment that he expects? That is lower than the minimum interim payment for the Post Office, and so I would like some clarity on what that means. And the same, the Minister says that he expects those payments to start from 90 days. Does he mean 90 days from now to be completed by the summer, or a 90-day period in the summer? It wasn't quite clear from the statement. Finally, public inquiries are at the gift of the Prime Minister. There's no formal way of them being agreed, apart from campaigners and people in this House, people like my honourable friend from Hull North, who force the Prime Minister to take action. And that does not seem like a coherent way that we right wrongs in this country. So will we start to think about a proper public inquiries reform that includes the duty of candour, includes a public advocate, and includes a way that committees of this House could launch those inquiries when serious matters occur?
Order. Just before the Minister answers those questions, let me make it clear that in a statement of this kind, each member has the opportunity to ask a question. Now, I'm very anxious that everybody who wishes to ask a question should be able to do so on behalf of their constituents, but it really has to be one question per person. I've been lenient with the honourable gentleman, and I suspect that the Minister will want to answer all of those questions. Minister.
Thank you. On the point about the 210,000, look, I took advice on what was the most I could comfortably secure to get out. He will see documents published today around the schemes for different conditions. I hope things will become clearer for him. I'm happy to correspond with him on that. On the timing, I said that the payments will happen in 90 days, beginning in the summer. I can't say which day of the summer, but 90 days is the time period. He makes some point, as Sir Brian did, about public inquiries and how they're initiated. I think there are a number of points that he also says with respect to how you would implement that. I think that's a matter for further conversation in subsequent weeks and debates.
Paul Hull.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I, like many others, obviously welcome the statement yesterday and the comprehensive follow-up today. My Sedgefield constituent, David Farry, has been in touch, asking me to thank the Prime Minister for his apology, to thank the member for Maidenhead for initiating the public inquiry, and the Chair, Sir Brian, for his work. And I'm sure David will be pleased to hear the Minister's words earlier. But can I add my voice to those calling for this to be a watershed moment in public transparency? And on behalf of David, ask him to make real progress as urgently as possible so David and others can start to think about moving on from these appalling events.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. To David and to every individual affected by this, I can assure him that we are doing everything we can to deliver this as quickly as possible. And the wider challenge to the culture of government and institutions in this country is something that we will also address, and there'll be an opportunity to discuss that in the coming weeks.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I paid tribute to all of those who fought so hard for justice for so long. It is impossible to truly imagine the pain and harm done to so many, including to some of my Brighton constituents who have shared with me their deeply harrowing stories. The setting up of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority is very welcome, and I echo those who've called for that body to be made accountable to Parliament. But would the government consider going further and potentially setting up an independent body to monitor and follow up all the recommendations and inquiries such as this? Because without such a mechanism, without such a body, there really does risk being a significant accountability gap, because no one is directly charged with the effective oversight of the implementation of all of these recommendations.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her representations on that. I think it's certainly something that needs to be carefully considered in the context of all that Sir Brian has said. And I think one of the challenges in terms of accountability is when recommendations are made outside of this place and they encounter the challenge of delivery, that sometimes the challenge of delivery means things have to be done slightly differently, but they do meet the spirit of the recommendations. And so we need to make sure that in that accountability mechanism there is sufficient scope to recognise that challenge. Otherwise, we'll be in a position where we'll be making false judgments. But the spirit of what she's saying needs to be taken forward, and the government needs to reflect on that thoughtfully.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2010, my then constituent Andrew March, himself a victim of contaminated blood since the age of 9, succeeded in a judicial review that found the payment of compensation by the UK government was flawed. He said then, "We hope the government will now consider the whole issue of compensating those so tragically affected by the contaminated blood disaster, instead of making token derisory ex gratia payments." It's taken a further 14 years for government to follow the leads of the courts and now the inquiry in calling for justice for Andrew and the thousands of other victims. From 2010, we attended countless meetings, debates and briefings, and heard warm words from a succession of health ministers. Nothing happened for years, and then matters proceeded at a glacial pace. What mechanism will be enforced to ensure the scheme announced today is implemented with rigour and urgency?
Minister.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Look, I think we can go back to the Heath, Callaghan, Wilson, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, Theresa May governments, all of them come in for criticism, come under criticism. Theresa May initiated a public inquiry with significant input from numbers of people across the House. I think we've all been very clear on the government side that we wish things had happened sooner, but I am doing everything I can to move this forward today. I'm resisting any attempt to politicise this. The Honourable Gentleman makes some points about accountability. We have an immediate obligation to put into regulations within 3 months of royal assent, regulations that will essentially activate the arm's length body. We have a shadow entity in place. We have an interim CEO, an interim chair, and engagement planned for literally the coming days, with 20 people employed by the end of next week. I will continue to work with anyone and everyone across the House to make sure that we meet expectations on this.
Just for the record, I know that the Honourable Gentleman meant to refer to the Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead. No need for apology. The Honourable Gentleman is answering very fully and correctly, and I didn't want to interrupt him not at all. Stuart MacDonald.
There was indeed much to welcome in what the Minister said today, but can I take him back to the issue of existing support schemes, which are, of course, incredibly important for so many. And the second interim report at recommendation 13 said current annual payments under the support schemes should be continued and guaranteed for life, and further that such payments should only be taken into account in assessing awards for future financial loss or care provision. It wasn't immediately clear to me that what the Minister was saying today was consistent with that recommendation and trying to implement it. Could you provide that clarity now, because this would be very important for people listening in?
Yes, I absolutely can. I'll be very clear about the continuing commitment the government has on existing support schemes. But clearly there is a point when the assessment is made on compensation entitlement under the new scheme and the interaction with what has come before. With then options set out. But again, this is something I want to give reassurance on today, and the detail of how that will work out must be done with the consent and approval of the communities involved.
Stephen Kinnett.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I just build on a point made by my honourable friend, the member for North Durham, earlier about the risk of unscrupulous financial advisors swooping in, and it's appalling to even think that it might be possible, but we have a lot of experience on that based on the British Steel pension scheme, and I'd be happy to discuss any of those lessons learned with the Minister. But specifically on the point about my constituent David Farrugia, who tragically lost his father 40 years ago due to this appalling scandal, could I just press the Minister to give a bit more detail on the specifics of how it's going to work for bereaved families, bereaved children and parents of victims? How and when specifically will they be able to register for compensation?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. We've had previously engaged on the British Steel matter, and the unscrupulous exploitation of people moving from defined benefit to defined contribution schemes is something that's in the top of my mind, and I'm applying into consideration of these matters. He asks about his constituent David and bereaved children. The principle here is that affected and infected individuals qualify in their own right. The passporting of affected to qualify based on the infected and the estates of infected is clear. The details of how that process will happen will become very clear very quickly. We will have resources available through a website to register for updates in order that people can receive that as quickly as they wish. But forgive me, I can't say more than that today, but I think I've set out the principles of how this will operate. The operationalisation needs to happen quickly, and I will update more in due course.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to pay tribute to my constituent, Robert Angwin, who's campaigned for justice for himself and all others affected by this scandal for decades. Yesterday and today, from both sides of the House, we've heard the line, lessons have been learned, action will be taken. Madam Deputy Speaker, I imagine that's exactly what we would have heard in 1972 if we're here when the thalidomide scandal broke 11 years later. Since then, we've had OxyContin, we've had Vioxx, We've had Primados. The list goes on and on, Madam Deputy Speaker, all the way to the experimental COVID-19 vaccines today. Does the Minister agree that the only real lesson that's been learned has been learned by the public, that they can't trust government, any government, to protect them from unsafe medicines and treatments, and crimes have been committed, and it's a crime to cover up a crime? When are the arrests going to start? And if that has to include current and former members of this House, then so be it.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I think Sir Robert makes clear some very profound challenges to the British state that need a profound response from government, and that will happen in due course.
Hannah Bardell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my Livingston constituent Linda Cannon lost her husband after he received a blood transfusion that infected him with hepatitis C. And my constituent Vera Gaskin has stage 2 chronic cirrhosis of the liver from contaminated blood. She spends her life explaining that she is not an alcoholic. So what guidance and comfort does the Minister have for my constituents that anybody that will oversee compensation and justice will be fully transparent and will not end up in the mess that the expert panel of the Primados scandal ended up in? And will he give a cast-iron guarantee that the general election that is due to be held this year will not delay any aspect of this, because we cannot have a situation where the structures and procedures of this place that have so long protected those in power and allowed them to do harm will thwart the justice and progress for all of our constituents?
The Honourable Lady makes a powerful representation on behalf of Linda and so many. I can assure her that speed is of the essence, and in all circumstances I'm trying to move forward the will of this House as it is. I can't account for when electoral events will be triggered, but what I can say is that the point about sensitivity to the individual experience, the stigma, the trauma associated with engaging with officialdom in all aspects needs to be properly addressed through the way that this arm's length body is operated.
Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wanted to put on record the tenacity of my constituent Steve Bartram, a victim of the blood scandal. He contracted the hepatitis when he was 7, experimented on. Driven out of his home because of people who believed that he had an infectious disease and had to be run out. He then came to my constituency, and I would say to the Minister that he welcomes what's been said, but he's anxious. Like thousands of others, he's anxious that this isn't going to work out. And I guess maybe he could look at a compensation scheme like the Windrush scandal, where less than 10% of those who are owed compensation have received anything. So he and many others, with good reason, are extremely anxious that the government will follow through on this. Can you ensure that they do?
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I think it's a reasonable characterisation that welcome and anxiety. It was my job to meet that anxiety with practical steps that secure confidence in the passage to full delivery. I've set out those in some detail. There'll be a number of documents that he'll be able to use to support what I've said today and to send to his constituents, as all colleagues will across the House. I hope that will be helpful and inform and remove some of the anxiety that does exist.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's vital that we not only thank those campaigners who've struggled through pain and loss to this situation, but also appreciate the deep public service that they've carried out in exposing this outrageous scandal. So, whilst I welcome what it seems to be a comprehensive statement on compensation today, this scandal has, as others have said, gone on too long and therefore should be concluded quickly for compensation. But that's only part of the issue of justice for these campaigners. Now, I appreciate what the Minister said about his ability to talk about future events, but will he at least commit to the principle for his government of ensuring those involved in deliberate cover-up, adding to the delay and suffering and causing death, will face justice themselves?
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I can't speak for the collective will of government, but I think he makes a completely reasonable and logical point and case, and I do support the principles of what he's saying. We need to respond to the report's recommendations specifically, coherently and in full, and that is what in due course we will do.
Emma Liulbach.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday's apologies and this compensation is the beginning of justice for the thousands of lives lost and ruined. The Minister will know, though, that Sir Brian Langstaff found downright deception, an attitude of denial. He was clear that this has been no accident. Public service is an honour that comes with great responsibility. Individuals and organisations have failed in that responsibility and betrayed that honour. I've heard the Minister's earlier responses, but can he at least indicate to us when the Government will express a view on criminal charges?
I thank the Honourable Lady for a powerful representation on that matter. I cannot give her a categorical assurance. I do hope that by setting out a clear opportunity to discuss the report in its different dimensions, I hope in a few weeks' time, that we will start that process. Obviously, other ministers will lead on some of these matters, and the evidence and where it leads us will also determine what those options are. But I think she speaks for so many across this House that these are serious matters that need a serious response from government in its different elements.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just wanted to acknowledge 3 of my constituents who've been in touch over the last few weeks. One who lost both her brother and her cousin as a result of treatment for haemophilia, and 2, including Karen Pearce, who have suffered lifelong health problems as a result of being infected. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been in this place for rather less time than most of my colleagues, only less than 2.5 years, and I am struck by the number of scandals where huge institutional cover-ups have happened just in that short period. Can I echo the comments of colleagues from all parties that we must have a duty of candour, because we will repeat this again and again and again until we do.
Yes, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point on duty of candour. I think it's one that several have made this afternoon, and the government will reflect and respond in due course very carefully. Thank you.
Clive Efford.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Paymaster General's statement, but we have to remind ourselves that many of us have been coming here for the past year asking for a response to Sir Brian Langstaff's interim report from last April. And we've been told that the government is moving ahead at pace, but there's no evidence of that, even with the statement today. Now, Sir Brian Langstaff has made some clear recommendations about how he wants the oversight of his recommendations going forwards. That must involve the victims of this, because that's why we're here today. Without the victims who have doggedly and determinedly demanded that they have justice in this affair, they have brought us to this point where the Paymaster General is making this statement, and they must have oversight of how we respond to Sir Brian Langstaff's report, and as this House must have, because across both sides of this House, people have been trying to hold the government to account over this. And the Horizon scheme has an advisory body to oversee compensation, which has an honourable member from this House and from the other place. Do you envisage having any advisory body of a similar sort for this compensation scheme?
Well, I don't think you can characterise what I've announced today as not making significant progress. I'm not here to claim credit for it or to say what it's attributed to, other than the work of Sir Brian Langstaff and those who've campaigned. Absolutely, at the core of what I've said, the immediate next steps is the work of Sir Robert Francis to engage with the infected and affected communities, to define the regulations that the government is obliged, rightly so, to bring to this House within 3 months of the royal assent of the bill. He makes another point about how this House could be involved in accountability of that arm's length body. I'm happy to reflect on that and come back at another point.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I put on record my absolute admiration for the victims and their families and their loved ones throughout this process, and pay tribute to my own constituent, Susan Hallwood, and her partner, Dave McCall. Susan had 3 sons, All had haemophilia, and 2 received contaminated blood, and both contracted HIV and died of AIDS. Brian, age 16, and Stephen, age 9, and Susan gave evidence at the inquiry, and I want to thank her for doing that. And it's right that they are receiving an apology and compensation, but of course that will never be enough. And I would ask the Minister to address the issue of accountability, the issue of individual accountability for those culpable of doing wrong, and organisational accountability. And I ask him what he can do to make sure that this is not another example of compensation without accountability to add to Hillsborough and Windrush and other scandals that we've seen.
The Honourable Gentleman speaks very powerfully about his constituents, Susan, David and their family. I think he also makes the point quite clearly that compensation by itself isn't enough. I think, though, with respect to the wider accountability of institutions, hospitals, civil servants, the interaction between civil servants and government ministers and the NHS, there is a lot of complexity there in how we respond appropriately and thoughtfully, both altogether and on individual cases. So I hope he will respect what I'm saying and hope that we can engage on this at a future point in this chamber.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was contacted this morning by a constituent who, to the best of my knowledge, has never come forward before. That's something we're still trying to establish. As a 12-year-old girl, she received a blood transfusion that was infected with hepatitis B. She has lived with that infection for 70 years because she was infected not in the 1970s but in the 1950s. Can the Minister give an assurance that the compensation and other support that has been outlined today will be available to all victims regardless of how long ago they were infected, and can outline what he's doing to make sure that others like my constituent do not miss out simply because they didn't realise that this applied to them as well?
Absolutely, the eligibility is clear. If people were infected by those NHS blood products and infected tissues, that they qualify. The only challenge is how do you verify that when records go back a long way, but those are challenges that can be met and we need to find ways of doing so.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I also begin by paying tribute to all those infected and affected in my constituency of Cynon Valley in Wales and beyond, and in particular Lynn Kelly, who is the chair of Haemophilia Wales, who've campaigned tirelessly over many decades for justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, the inquiry's compensation report recommended that an interim payment be paid to recognise deaths of people to date unrecognised, including bereaved parents, children or siblings. And the Minister will be aware that there are 28 such cases in Wales. You met with Haemophilia Wales a fortnight ago. Now, I note in your statement, the Minister made reference to interim payments. But can I please ask him to clarify that interim payments for previously unrecognised deaths, including those in Wales, will be made? And can he be specific on when those individuals will receive those payments? And can he be entirely clear if they will be paid through the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme? We'll have to wait for the UK compensation scheme to be established. Thank you.
Thank you. She's right to pay tribute to Lynn Kelly, who I met in Cardiff, as she knows. I just want to clarify, there are 2 interim payments here that we've been talking about. One that we put into legislation to £100,000 for the estates of deceased infected, where previously they haven't received that payment. We're working through with the infected blood support schemes how that will work. I can't update on that at this moment because we are working with them to determine that. And then the second interim payment, which builds on the 100,000 for the infected alive that I mentioned, which is 210,000, building on the one of 100,000 at the end of in 2022. That will happen in 90 days, starting in the summer. That will be given through the existing infected blood compensation schemes. The interim payment will, in order to expedite that as quickly as possible. And then we will update in the autumn With respect to the balancing payments, you'll recognise that that is part of a bigger payment people will be entitled to, how that works according to the journey of work and engagement with the communities in the next few weeks.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you ever so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. For over 20 years, I've supported constituents caught up in this unprecedented scandal and tragedy, and I want to mention just two of them. Bill Wright, who the Minister knows, who has led Haemophilia Scotland with such energy and enthusiasm for about the last 2 decades, and a woman called Tricia Tritheridge, who introduced me to the scandal back in 2001 when I was first elected, who unfortunately can't be with us because she died of age-related conditions in 2013. And I want to say to the Minister, well done. I think he's delivered, I have to say that. I think he's answered and reassured people generally well about some of the questions and outstanding issues that are still there. But I sort of suspected to be taken about last, so I just want to sort of say to the Minister that he will know what is now required. I think he's got the compensation side of it right. It's the responsibility and accountability side of the equation that now has to be addressed. Now, he's talked about a debate when we come back afterwards. He sort of hinted at other departments looking at all this. But we need to hear tangible effort and energy into what is going to happen to ensure that people are held to account and responsibility for the decades of obfuscation, of not taking responsibility, and for even lies that came to us as members of Parliament and people like ministers from officials. When are we going to hear solid action about how this is going to be addressed?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind words, and particularly his words about Bill Wright, who I enjoyed meeting, who I know has campaigned so hard for so long, and the constructive way that Bill and his colleagues engaged with me, asking me reasonable but tough questions, and I hope that I've answered some of those today. He draws me from the compensation to other elements, and I'm frustrated that I can't offer him more clarity today, but I think he puts on record the need for a substantive response on a number of other elements beyond compensation, but he can be assured of my continuing commitment to deliver on that journey to full implementation of compensation as I've set out.
Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 20 years ago, the late former chair of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, Philip Dolan, said that for years, every time we've reached the top of the mountain, the cloud lifts and there's another mountain to climb. And I think from the Minister's statement today, there is some sense that there might not be another mountain to climb, but there is a need for some transparency, particularly in what he's talked around eligibility, tariffs, the appeal process, and crucially timelines, so that people can have confidence of when this is going to happen. Will people have access to legal aid if they wish to take their case, appeal their case? And on the point of existing compensation schemes, there's been some concern from a number of people about what's been announced today. In answer to the Honourable Member for Cumbernauld and Kirkintilloheast, he said they'd be shaped by people, that these schemes wouldn't just simply be abolished, but he has put a firm deadline of the 31st of March 2025. So can he outline exactly how people will be part of that process so they don't feel like they've lost out once again in this process?
Makes a number of questions. I haven't said that the existing schemes will stop on the 31st of March 2025. What I've committed to is that thereafter there is an uncertain process at this point with respect to when individuals will have their full assessment made, and I've made some assertions around how that needs to work. Some of the other things, though, that he makes the point about around accountability, transparency and so on, I haven't set out because they need to be informed by the communities through the process that I've said Sir Robert Francis is leading in the coming weeks. It will be, I hope, a constructive iterative process with government in order that the output of that work will lead to the right position of government subsequently in terms of the regulations we bring before this House.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I start by paying tribute to two of my constituents here today, Rachel and Justine Gordon-Smith, who have fought an extraordinary battle on behalf of their father over many years. And I pay tribute to their strength and to their ability to continue in the face of sometimes what look like intransigence from government. But they and the infected blood community will, I know, welcome much of what the Minister has announced today, but they are understandably wary of government after the deceptions and delays of the past. So can he guarantee full transparency of the deliberations of the arm's length body? And would he agree appropriate governance, as he said, would be achieved by including representatives of the community as members?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Indeed, I met Justine Gordon-Smith, and she has been a tenacious campaigner on behalf of so many, and obviously having lost her father. I can confirm that we will do everything we can to ensure that all communities, infected and affected, and there are considerable differences between them in terms of their views on how things should be conducted, but we will work to find a way of appropriately engaging them as these regulations are formed, but also ensure the right oversight takes place going forward so this arm's length body is something that they can rely on and have full confidence in, wherever they are in the United Kingdom.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have 6 constituents who've been in touch with me, infected and affected by this awful scandal. Many of those still want to maintain anonymity, such is the stigma that still persists today about these cases that they have, about these illnesses that they have contracted. But I was very pleased to see that my constituent Maria was there yesterday. She first came to see me in December 2015, 8.5 years, on top of the long time that she already had to wait. Is a long and arduous journey, and I'm glad and I hope that she and all those affected and infected got what they wanted from Sir Brian Langstaff's report yesterday. But to ask specifically about what he said in his statement about interim payments, I'm not clear of whether the 6 constituents in touch with me will be eligible for this, because he said that interim payments will be made to living infected beneficiaries and the estates of those who pass away between now and payments being made. Now, that isn't clear to me that if somebody tragically passed away yesterday, that their estates would not be eligible for this. Neither those from the interim report until the final scheme is in place, whether all of those people would be eligible. And it would be perverse, would it not, that particularly children whose parents have died and adults who have so tragically lost their children might not be eligible for these interim payments. So could I ask for some clarity on that eligibility? Because there are people who should not be losing out. They've already suffered too much, and they should be eligible for these payments as soon as possible.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I note her presence there yesterday alongside me. I'm very happy to engage with her to clarify for her individual constituents. I'm very reluctant to make sort of binding assertions around individuals here on the floor of the House, because I don't want to mislead her or anyone else. But I'd be very happy if she writes to me to respond to her as fully as I can.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, a real pleasure to ask a question. First of all, can I just thank government for their apology, thank them for their compensation, and thank the Minister for his tone and his words, which were very humbly spoken, and I think encouraged us all across this chamber. That's not easy to do when you hear all the questions that are put forward. Victims have highlighted what they deem to be a lack of recognition and a lack of accountability. Today there is a recognition, and yet I do feel that within the accountability must be safeguards to ensure that similar medical experimental methods cannot be permitted to take hold and bring these devastating results ever again. So does the Minister not agree that whilst we can put right the wrong, we cannot put right the wrong, we can and must safeguard future children and adults, and this dreadful, family-destroying, heartbreaking, life-changing lesson is one that we all unwillingly and indeed shamefully have learned.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his thoughtful question, and I want to put on record my satisfaction to be in Belfast as part of the engagement exercise that I undertook. Look, I think in some ways, some of what Sir Brian Langstaff spoke about, we could not envisage happening again because of changes that have happened in the health service and in the way things operate 40 or 50 years on. But what he talks about is much deeper. It's about the culture of transparency and dependency and candour between civil servants, the NHS and government. That is a much more complicated set of issues to meet appropriately and fully. And so, forgive me, I won't be able to respond to his specific point today, but he articulates the challenge that we need to meet as government. And I look forward to playing my part, whatever that is, in meeting it.
Thank you. That concludes proceedings on the statement, and I thank the Minister for having taken a very large number of questions, having remained at the dispatch box for well over 2 hours, and for having answered every question thoroughly and carefully. Thank you. Point of order, Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This morning, a Home Office commissioned report from Lord Wolney was presented in Parliament using the motion for unopposed return procedure, effectively protecting it from any kind of legal challenge. However, the report reads as a highly political document, and it includes proposals, for example, for very serious restrictions on civil liberties and human rights. I understand it's not an order for members to criticise a member of the House of Lords in the Chamber, and Lord Wolney's interests as a paid advisor for the arms and oil industry are listed in the Register of Lords' Interests. But could you advise the House, when a report is given legal cover by this House, whether it would be at least healthy for scrutiny for there to be an additional requirement for any relevant interests by a report's author to be specifically flagged to this House as well?
The Honourable Lady, for her point of order, I can confirm that the effect of this morning's motion is that the report was published by order of the House. But the Honourable Lady asks about the financial interests of members of the House of Lords, and that, of course, is not a matter for the Chair of the House of Commons. But I do appreciate that the Honourable Lady makes a serious and valid point about the way in which the matter has been presented to this House, and if she has concerns about the content of the report, then I would advise that she might discuss with the Table Office how she might pursue the matter further. There are various lines of action open to her. Thank you. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to establish national policy guidelines in respect of children with a parent in prison, including for the identification of the children of prisoners at the point of sentence and for accountability for providing support to the children of prisoners and for connected purposes. I want to start by saying what this bill is not about. It is not about prisoners. There is some good and important work being done with prisoners and their families. We know there's often a value in maintaining family ties. It helps prisoners cope with their sentences and makes it less likely they'll reoffend when they're released. But this is not about them. It is about their children, some of whom will have contact with their parent in prison, many of whom won't. If the parent is inside for domestic violence or for sexual offences involving children, or indeed if the child was the victim of the parent's crime, there might well not be contact. Or if there's been a long history of criminal behaviour, of addiction, of violence, or if there just wasn't ever much of a family unit in the first place. So we don't start with the prisoner's well-being, we start with what is in the child's best interest. And we start from a difficult place because we simply don't know how many children have a parent in prison. We don't know who they are, where they are, who is looking after them, not in any kind of systemic way. They are the invisible children. As Sarah Burrows, the Chief Exec of Children Heard and Seen, who is here today, is a charity which does excellent work to identify, mentor and support children with parents in prison. As she's fond of saying, we know exactly how many Labradors there are in this country, yet we don't know how many children have a parent in prison. And that is why this bill is needed. I'm not going to prejudge now what a statutory mechanism for identifying and supporting children with a parent in prison could look like, although I do want to pay tribute to Sergeant Russ Massey of Thames Valley Police and the work he's led on Operation Paramount. And I do think that the unique child identifier number being proposed by Labour's education team might play a role. In 2019, CRESS estimated that around 312,000 children a year were affected by parental imprisonment. 17,000 of them, it would be their mother. The MOJ has now commissioned a BOLD, that's Better Outcomes Through Linked Data report, which will use government data to estimate how many children have a parent in prison, and those statistics will be released on 13th of June. There has been a lot of work behind the scenes to get us to this point, and I particularly want to thank the Honourable Member for Edisbury for his help, and the Children's Commissioner who has been backing this bill, and also for the various ministers who've met us over the years. But we need more than just a snapshot of how many children are affected. We need a mechanism so that at the point when an adult is sentenced to imprisonment, someone finds out whether there are any children involved, and someone is then responsible for making sure those children are okay. We know that at the moment this isn't always picked up. Sometimes the question isn't asked. Sometimes a prisoner doesn't want the authorities to know because they're worried the kids will be taken into care. Often schools have no idea. Children Heard and Seen see cases where children have simply been left to fend for themselves, and I want to mention a few. A man went to prison for sexual offences. It was only after the house was targeted by vigilantes that a victim support caseworker found that his 15-year-old daughter was living there on her own. A criminologist conducting research in a women's prison was told by a prisoner that her 2 daughters were living on their own without any money for food and sanitary protection. A 16-year-old boy was arrested at the same time as his parents. He was released shortly afterwards and left to be the sole carer of his 8-year-old brother. An employer requested a welfare check after a woman hadn't shown up to work for 2 months. When the police went round to the address, they discovered her 15-year-old son living on his own. There was no gas or electricity, and he'd been getting up and going to school every single day without anyone knowing that his mum was in prison. Kinship carers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings often play an important role in stepping up when a parent goes to prison, and they need support to do so. But there's also a real risk children will end up living somewhere entirely unsuitable with people who will abuse them, neglect them and exploit them. More often than not, however, there is a parent, usually the mother, at home, but children can still be badly affected. One of the bloggers on the Children Heard and Seen website said, "We're not the victims, we are the collateral damage." There's an emotional loss, a sense of abandonment. There's perhaps a sense of injustice if they feel that their mum or dad has been wrongfully jailed. Or there's anger that their mum or dad has chosen to commit a crime, not caring what happens to them as a result. On a practical level, it could mean a big change in the family's financial situation, having to move house, move schools, going on to free school meals. Having to change your names and leave town altogether because it's been all over the papers that your dad is a sex offender. And I've met a family that happened to. And perhaps most damaging of all, it's the stigma and the shame of being associated with a parent's crime. Being bullied at school, being seen as trouble by the teachers. As one mother said, "I'd moved areas because I felt like I was being watched all the time. People were talking and we were being discriminated against when it was not something that we've done. Kids are innocent and I've had to move schools, which has been more upheaval. It's just a nightmare." Children Heard and Seen use the hashtag #ItWasn'tMe. The child hasn't done anything wrong, but in so many ways the child is being punished too. The research from CRESS that I mentioned earlier from 2019 found that children of prisoners are at risk of significantly worse outcomes than children not affected by parental imprisonment, including lifelong mental health problems and being involved in the criminal justice system themselves later in life. It's been suggested that 65% of boys with a parent in prison go on to offend. Others say that a child with a parent in prison is 3 or 4 times more likely to get into trouble. Although it is difficult to separate out other factors in a child's upbringing, the same factors that might have led their parent to become involved in crime, like poverty or family instability. What is clear is that by supporting and mentoring children, it is possible to break that cycle. I've met many adults from all walks of life, still deeply affected by the trauma of their childhood experience. We've met in this building, we've shared stories. What is striking is just how difficult it is for them to talk about it many years down the line. A few months ago, I watched a brilliant documentary, The Edge of Everything, about Ronnie O'Sullivan, whose father was jailed for murder when he was 17. And it was actually heartbreaking to hear him talk about it, to see the pain writ large on his face some 30 years later. He's #1 in the world.